Hello and welcome again to another one of my quick videos. In this example, I'm actually going to run through some of the great content that's been provided by one of our partners, is SOC Prime. They have done something, a bunch of content specifically around the Wannacry ransomware. This has been around for a little bit and the content has been as well, and it's been very well published on the community, the Protect 724 community that's been available. So I took the opportunity to dig into this, go a little bit more through the content, explain a little bit around what it does, how it works, and talk about how you can use your SIEM in this particular example, the ArcSight ESM platform, to do some of the detection to help around the Wannacry ransomware specifically. Now, if you hadn't seen the news in the last 6 months, you might not have heard about Wannacry, but this was a pretty unique bit of malware that allows itself to replicate between Windows systems using the SMB communications protocol. It's attributed to a particular group of actors called shadow brokers, and it's used to encrypt files on systems, and then what the idea was is that you would actually have to pay to have them decrypted, ransomware being the key bit of malware there. It's actually managed to inflict more than 100 countries worldwide, and actually got a huge amount of international media attention, primarily because there's some of the organizations that were impacted by this. For example, hospitals, ambulance services, financial energy services, even some actual drug manufacturing organizations have been impacted heavily by this. It's what some people call non-malware attack, but it really doesn't require a file dropper specifically, and the idea is it spreads between the particular systems within an organization by using this SMB communications. In this particular case, the behavior was that it actually encrypts data that it identifies on your servers and workstations, and then typically it was asking for a payment of around about $300 worth of Bitcoin, untraceable virtual currency, to allow you to actually decrypt that from the actually encrypted and infected hosts. Anyway, enough about that, and now to dig a little bit more around what it does and some of the things you can do around it. Now, I have to stress, from a remediation point of view, clearly a backup system and process is exactly what you need here. And have you got a effective backup process, maybe doing daily backups? Of course, it's essential you have to ensure that you test that, do regular testing processes to ensure that you can recover your data. And clearly that's one of the most effective remediation aspects from a ransomware point of view. However, what I will also stress now is that we can actually dig into what we can do with an SIEM and how we can use that to help piece together some of the indicators of how this kind of malware can affect and how you can stop it in its tracks specifically. So, like I say, this has actually been produced by one of the partners for ArcSight ESM, a company called SOC Prime. I'll make sure all the links to the packages, to the indicators, and to the further documentation on Protect 724 is provided below. So please do check that out and have a closer look at what actually it's doing and what it looks like and so on. So what we're actually doing here is actually just using some of the indicators, or IOCs, or indicators of compromises, that's more likely called, that we were identified as part of the ransomware operation. And actually, it's very simple and very straightforward for us to collect that data together and have a closer look at what it's actually involved. And what I'm actually going to do is just give you a very quick summary of some of that information. So, for example, you can actually see, again, it's all linked to in the comments below. We can actually see some of the indicators. This is a really good source of information that actually allows us to piece together a lot of the activity. And you can see that actually comes from lots of different sources and information. Now, it's actually provided as a comma-separated file here. So you can use this in other systems, devices. You can pull it into other enforcement components, for example, for the relevant information too. But clearly, this is actually added into the ArcSight platform with regards to lists as well. So we'll actually go into that in a little bit more detail. One thing I will quickly do, though, is actually start stepping through the content around what it does and what it looks like, and what we're actually doing here is some of the capability. And what I should do is dig into some of the rules and what they're doing specifically. So we'll take a closer look at the actual content here. We can see that it's actually going into a particular section. Everything's provided in this particular content package, again, free of charge from SOC Prime. So great. Thank you guys for actually putting this together and making it available free of charge too. So one of the things that the Wannacry malware actually does is it we'll try to make a connection to the torproject.org organization specifically. So we can actually just take a closer look at the rule there. I just pop it up. We can see the conditions that it's talking about. It's very simple and very straightforward, and the content's actually very good and focused around that. So we can see that we're actually just making sure that there is no communications, or we're making sure that there is communications to an external event. Again, nice little tool tippet that you might not be aware of. If you go to the summary tab and you can see that it's just a description of the logic here. If you actually either click or hold over the actual bit where it says the filter, it'll give you the contents of the filter itself there. So what we're doing there is we're making sure that this is an external communications because we want to make sure that this is something connecting to the Tor project. And in this particular example, go back to the conditions. We can actually see we're just making sure that it's going to a particular kind of destination there. That's a very simple thing as it tries to communicate and do part of its process of trying to communicate to the Tor project. The next thing we need to do is have a closer look at some of the other rules, specifically around some of the indicators. Now that's very simple and we don't have to do too much around that. But if, for example, if I dig into this particular rule and have a closer look at connection to Wannacry distribution IP, this is where the open source intelligence really comes into use here, or often called OSINT. What we're doing again is we're making sure that we're having some external communications here. Again, it's just a filter, and we can go to summary and just hover over that to see that. But what we're doing is we're looking up in this list for the information around the distribution IP addresses. So this is where the OSINT comes in that allows us to identify that. Now, why is this useful? Well, it's useful because we can pull that data together from lots of different sources, specifically ones that have been sharing this and making available for us to understand that. But more importantly, when the ransomware was released, it was hard-coded with a whole bunch of information with regards to IP addresses, domains, and so on. So we can very quickly identify that, put that into a list, and have some very simple rules. Just check against those lists and what we know as those indicators from OSINT to identify that we can see that there is a connection to some sort of distribution IP. We can also have a closer look at the Wannacry IP or host here as well rule, and let's just have a look at the conditions for that one too. This is a little bit more complicated because now we actually want to look at lots of different aspects. So again, we want to make sure that this is some sort of external communications, but we also want to check a number of lists for information here. We want to check the IP addresses, and we also make sure that it's, if we do have the port number, it's a combination of the port number as well. We also want to make sure that there is the host names in there as well with regards to that too. There is an exception capability as here. I'll talk about that a little bit more detail in a minute because we do want to make sure that we're not doing anything excessive here. Of course, in all of these situations, we do want to have a rule that will actually do something. So we actually just jump to the Actions tab. We can see that we're actually putting this information onto an active list that allows us to track some of this information. This becomes very useful, and an active list construct is a very, very powerful aspect as well. And I'll actually talk a little bit more about this in a minute with regards to the date and timestamps and counts as well when we take a closer look at the actual active list that we're looking at too. When I want to take a little bit a closer look at things, for example, closer connections to external multiple hosts. Again, let's take a quick look at the rules here. It's exactly how you'd expect it to be. So we're looking for, in this particular case, external communications, that the source address is not coming from a specific set of IP addresses, for example, and we've got some exceptions in there as well. Now, the reasons for the exceptions is, for example, we probably going to have some internal IP addresses that are probably going to get multiple connections through them. So, for example, you might find things like proxy servers and other scenarios that might actually trigger this multiple times. So we want to have, in this particular example, a list where we can put some exception IP addresses on this so we can exclude those from some of the alerting. Because what we'll find is, again, as I mentioned it a second ago, as the actions, we're putting that information onto an active list. We want to make sure that we're actually tracking that where there's an exception and not putting it onto that active list for us. We're also checking on some of the activity as well. Just before I go there, you'll notice there that this particular exception rule is disabled by default. Do bear that in mind. If you are getting some false positives on this particular content pack, turn this rule on. Again, it's very simple. You just right mouse click and enable rule, and then make sure you populate some of the information into the exception list. The details is there, so just bear that in mind as part of that. We've also got the network scan, so let's take a quick look at this particular rule. Again, let's look at the conditions. So again, looking for external communications from network communications. We're not part of the exceptions, and we're looking at particular port numbers. Now, this is a really good point just to mention a couple of points here with regards to what we're looking at. Now, it would be fantastic from a network security point of view, using something like an IDS, IPS technology, or your endpoint protection technologies like anti-malware or the antivirus solutions that you might have on the endpoints, that would have a specific signature for this particular kind of malware. What we're doing here is we're looking at activities, and that's what a SIEM is great at doing. Look at general sets of activities that produce indicators. So, for example, we want to see that there is a connection to the Tor project. We want to see that there's connection to specific IOCs from OSINT that we've identified before, and maybe it's doing a network scan on the internal networks and so on. That gives us a good picture of what is going to be a particular instance of this malware that's been triggered. We're not looking at signatures. We're looking at activities and indicators together that give us that. This is a great example. You would expect pretty much every Windows host to be generating some sort of trigger on this rule where we're looking at network activity on those port numbers. That's pretty obvious. But when it's linked to these other things as well, that gives us a much better and more precise indicator around this particular set of malware. So that's why we're doing it. And that's why an SIEM works in this particular way. And then finally, let's have a closer look at the Windows host activity. Again, it's exactly how you expect it to be looking at. We're looking at particular Windows file-related events only, and it's looking at particular file paths, hashes, or files that are being accessed. Again, the malware was written in such a way that it was hard-coded with a lot of this information in the first place. Probably a really good point for me to jump into is actually have a closer look at some of the dashboards that were provided in this content pack. So we can see there's a whole bunch, there's just a couple here that's regarded here. Let's just open this particular one. I can show the dashboard and shuffle the view. Now, I don't have any sample scenarios where I've actually generated, and I certainly don't want to be touching malware on my test environments here because the risk of mishandling it is too high. So I don't actually have any triggered events here, so we don't see anything. However, we can see that there's a great little dashboard here that shows us how this is working together. So we can see what we consider to be potentially infected hosts and some overall activity around whether it's going up, is it going down, some particular counts of what we think are being triggered as high priority hosts and servers that we consider to be a part of the Wannacry malware infections as well, and then some overall activity here. As a scenario, I do actually have a screenshot of what was produced previously. Here we go. This is a populated screenshot. We can see that there's some nice moving averages. We can see some counts here. So again, thinking about how an SIEM works, we can see that there's a whole bunch here with regards to some of the number counts. So we can see 43 under the all potential infected hosts by event counts. So we can see that particular host has got 43 triggered sets of rules. So that gives us a very strong probability that that particular host has been infected somehow. And then we've got the other SOC channel underneath for us to view that too. Jumping back to the console, let's have a closer look at some of the lists as well, just so we can understand what's being provided as part of this. Now, there's a whole bunch of lists that's been provided. These are not excessive, and let me just have a closer look at those. So let's get rid of that view. We've got a list that's tracking the potentially infected hosts there. That's just got the IP addresses that's stored within that. It's worth noting, let me just have a closer look at this. We're actually storing a whole bunch of information here. I mentioned I was going to come back to this in a minute. So we're storing the IP address, destination IP addresses, and some generic information. If we've got any triggers with regards to the particular active lists from the data we've got in there. But remember, this is a list and it'll store the date and time on it as well. And that becomes really useful to start pulling together accuracy around some of our OSINT and around some of our activity as well. So what do I mean by that? Well, if I have a closer look at, say, for example, some of these lists, let's just have a closer look at some of this information here. So we've got the distribution IP addresses. Let's look at the IP addresses in general and show entries there. So this is a much better list with regards to the IP addresses. In some cases, we've got port numbers that's come from the source. Has it making use of the Tor connections? And more importantly, we can see when it was seen and when it was last seen. So we've got some date and time relevant information, so we can have much more quality indicators that matches the correct time around that open source intelligence as well. We can also see where that intelligence has come from. We can see there's a whole mix of information there, whether it's come from energy companies. In this particular example, this is one of the organizations that got hit very hard. We can see it's come from McAfee. We can see there's also Cisco, HPE themselves, and a couple of other different sources in there too. The important thing here is that we're tracking this information. Open source intelligence shouldn't just be one-dimensional sets of data. So it shouldn't just be an IP address. It shouldn't just be a port number. We need to start mapping some of this information together to do with the time span. These things change. These things manipulate themselves. So we need to understand the time period of when something was valid. And if we can corroborate that with further information, for example, from an IP address to a port number, then that becomes much more useful for it as well. We've also got the intelligence in here with regards to the files that it uses and the file hashes, so we can see the files that it's there and the particular sets of So we can see the file hashes here. Let's have a closer look at the entries there as well. So we can see all the file hashes that have been identified that maps to the file name. So it works both ways there. So we can look that up. You know, if we see a particular file name, does that match with the hash and vice versa? Now, you may not be tracking file hashes. You might not have an endpoint security solution that's tracking all that as well. It's useful to have that information. It does come with an overhead. Just getting the file names is probably a very good start, then mapping that with the IP addresses as well. But, you know, we have to build together a number of indicators to start giving us some of that evidence around some of the activity as well. But that's about as much as I was going to walk through with regards to the content. Again, great credit out to the guys at SOC Prime. Links below in the comments. Really do recommend you go take a look at what they have. This particular Wannacry ransomware package is available free of charge. There are other packages as well that they make available. Clearly, they want to entice people in to take a closer look at some valuable content that they've provided. But this gives you an insight on how you can use, in this particular example, operational intelligence, so open source intelligence mapped together with some simple lists and some simple rules of how we bring together a number of indicators to enable us to start identifying what we consider to be a serious bit of malware. And of course, from our actions point of view, it then becomes very simple how we could then tie that together into our SOC workflow and then maybe into our remediation tools to actually have some of these things blocked and then further impacted. Of course, we've got a lot of information with regards to IP addresses, so we can put that onto dynamic block lists on our firewalls. We can have the file hashes and file names encoded into our endpoint protection tools, so we can prevent these things from running as well. So we can provide a complete picture of what's actually going on and prevent this from actually affecting us long term. Anyway, that's about enough for the moment. I hope that was useful, and please, any questions, leave them in the comments below. Thank you very much.